It's the week ending Saturday, the 6th of November, and this is The Week Unwrapped. In the past 7 days, we've seen global leaders gathering in Glasgow for COP26, the discovery of 4-year-old Australian girl Cleo Smith found alive after 18 days missing, and much reaction to Facebook's name change to Meta. But we're here to bring you some stories that passed under the radar this week. Big news, not making headlines right now, but with repercussions for all our lives. I'm Olly Mann. Let's unwrap the week. And joining me today from the week's digital team is Kari Wilkin. From The Week magazine, editor Theo Tait. And from The Retrospectors, the daily history podcast that predates the hit new show Daily History by 6 months, and I have lawyers to prove it, it's Arion McNicoll. OK, Kari, you're up first. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
This was the week when Willygate was no laughing matter.
I think the other thing, of course, the elephant in the room in all this is the amount of online hate that we all get. It's out of control. I know the Home Secretary has talked about what more she wants to do. The online harms bill is going through pre-legislative scrutiny. I'm a free speech man. I want to defend that to my dying days. But at the same time, I think the amount of vile abuse and the vilification directed at MPs, and in particular female MPs, I think it's got to stop.
Deputy Prime Minister Dominic Raab speaking to Sky News last month. And Kari, he was talking there in reaction to the murder of the MP, Sir David Amess. What's happened this week?
Right, so yeah, as you said, the UK is considering tough new laws aimed at cracking down on online hate speech. And they're very similar to legislation that was introduced by Germany in 2018 that at the time was lauded as a model for other countries and a real groundbreaking moment. But those laws, the German laws, are now under renewed scrutiny as a result of a row that the German media have dubbed Pimmelgate or Willygate. And this all dates back to May when Hamburg's Interior Minister Andy Grote filed a complaint about a tweet that told him, "You are such a willy." And this was a response to Grote, who's a social democrat, having criticised what he called ignorant and stupid Hamburg citizens for going out partying during COVID, which created a lot of anger, not least because he'd done exactly the same thing the previous summer. He was fined €1,000 for celebrating his reappointment as minister in a Hamburg bar with 30 guests.
OK, but why has this made the headlines? I mean, this sounds like the kind of thing, it's not very nice, but public figures get sent all the time. Why are we talking about it?
This would have all died down, but his complaint to police triggered an investigation and a dawn raid on the unnamed Twitter user's home. And, the police and the prosecutor's office were accused of overreach. Grote has come in for a lot of mockery. There have been stickers and murals popping up all over Hamburg, basically saying Andy Grote is a willy. The Conservatives in Hamburg's parliament are calling for him to resign. They're saying that he's made himself a laughingstock. And it's just been reported, actually, that he's reportedly received death threats. So it had completely the opposite than intended effect.
Yes, and that's caused some people, Arion, to revisit the concept of the Streisand effect. Tell us why.
Yes, I think the Times pointed out that this was a typical example of the Streisand effect, which puts forward the idea that efforts to hide or censor information tend to have the exact opposite effect. And the name of the Streisand effect came about because these photos were taken of Barbra Streisand's house that were just aerial photos that were taken to try to map a bit of coastline on which her house was located. She said that this was an invasion of her privacy and wanted to sue the person who'd taken the photographs. But prior to them having these photographs being dragged through the courts, only 6 people had downloaded them, and after she drew attention to them through this court case, 240,000 people had downloaded them.
Right. So had this politician not drawn attention to the fact that someone had called him a willy on Twitter, we wouldn't all know about it.
Exactly. And also the fact that he did this triggered a dawn raid with cops coming to try to arrest the Twitter user in question. That got Hamburg's quite powerful countercultural scene, got their knickers in a bit of a twist. And they then reacted with, as Kari was saying, this sticker campaign saying, du bist so ein Pimmel, you're such a willy, that all went up over town. And then they had this big mural and that got painted over by the cops and they went back and painted over it again. And it's just escalated. It's done the exact opposite of what he wanted, and hence the Barbra Streisand effect.
But Theo, it's not his fault, is it, if the police overreacted? I mean, you might think he overreacted by reporting this particular piece of online abuse to the police when it seems fairly soft. But nonetheless, it was a piece of abuse on Twitter. It's up to the police to use their discretion what they're going to do about it. He probably wasn't anticipating a dawn raid. It's not his fault that happened.
Well, I think he probably reported it, and if you get a message from the city's interior minister, then maybe you feel like you're going to act on it. I don't know. I mean, what really blows my mind about this is, having spent a bit of time on German Wikipedia, it turns out that the insults are punishable under the German criminal code. This isn't even the new online law. This is like a thing going back to the post-war settlement, which is that if you insult someone, you can if they're a public figure defined as a dignitary, I don't know quite what that means, but you can be punished with imprisonment for up to 1 year or with a fine.
And yet, Kari, Germany is a place that really values freedom of speech for obvious reasons, is really careful about clamping down on people being anonymous, for example, for obvious reasons given their history. So what's the German feeling here? Do the public feel that the laws are a problem?
There have been a lot of criticism of these laws. It's really sort of called into question whether such protections work and at what cost to free speech. But these laws, judging by the run-up to the German election in September, for example, they don't appear to be having a massive effect in reducing hate speech online. Numerous studies found that, for example, between January and July, Facebook received more than 77,000 complaints and removed 11,500 pieces of content under these laws because they were deemed to be abusive. And a review by organisations that track hate speech on far-right Facebook groups, for example, found that there were actually far more that hadn't been removed that had been there for more than a year. So clearly, whatever the intent behind it, whether it is a repression of free speech, whether it is to protect politicians and other public figures, it doesn't appear to be working, which is particularly concerning given that the UK is heading towards very similar legislation.
Yes, but again, I wonder whether it's a question of police discretion, Arion. I mean, in this case, the term of abuse is relatively innocent and he's a man. But, we know that we have a problem with female MPs in particular, as the Deputy Prime Minister was saying in that clip, regularly receiving rape and murder threats. I mean, I think the public understand that something needs to be done about that.
I guess the question is to what extent you give police powers to investigate this kind of thing. And that's where the question marks are hanging over the proposed online safety bill that's being considered here. And coming back to what Theo was talking about, the laws that exist in Germany to prevent people from insulting one another. If you have those laws in place, then it allows for people to bring cases where they feel as though they have been harmed. And certainly there are going to be things that you want to extinguish, the kinds of rape threats and death threats that particularly female MPs are being subjected to, and a lot of women on the internet in general. That definitely needs to have a lid put on it. But I think that the minute you create laws that are too broad-reaching, then it does make way for the potential for frivolous claims. And the law that Theo mentioned, apparently in 2015, I wasn't able to go nearer into the future than that, but there were 200,000 cases of insults filed with prosecutors in Germany under that law. So a lot of people use these laws if they have access to them. And I think you do need to ask the question, are we making it too possible for people to feel as though insults need to result in some sort of litigation, if not criminal investigation?
Yes, and that is one of the criticisms of the online safety bill, isn't it, Theo, is that there are already extant laws to stop you threatening women with rape. There are already extant laws to stop you racially harassing someone. Many argue they just need to be enforced better on the internet. You don't need a whole new basket of laws.
I think the real difficulty is that all of these laws obviously were designed for when we had a much smaller press and not these sort of massive online platforms which, regard themselves by analogy with newspapers and think it's not their problem to police themselves. But then if you do put, as the online safety bill is going to do, if you put a duty on them to police their own content, then that makes them the censor. Do we really want Twitter being the censor of, deciding what... I mean, the idea in the online safety bill is that there are going to be categories of things which are lawful but harmful. So misinformation is not against the law, but it's harmful. And they'll have to crack down on these. So then they get a sort of absolutely massive remit of having to, Facebook, Twitter, whatever, all having to decide what's like things that are all right to go out there, which is incredibly problematic.
I think there's also the problem of there's just such a flood of online hate speech. You can't police and punish it all. Certainly in Germany, there's been a very good article written by a Spiegel columnist last week explaining how she'd received a death threat, but the prosecutor closed the case without taking any action. So it's obviously the police can't go after every single person that does this. So are MPs, for example, going to get priority over journalists or other high-profile figures? And so it's all very well to say this has got to be removed, we're going to punish it, but how exactly that's going to be done is a bit woolly.
A bit woolly, not a bit willy. Also, the coarsening of public discourse kind of cuts both ways, doesn't it? It's not just the public that are, writing naughty things about politicians. It's the politicians themselves that are prepared to play very low balls. I mean, Donald Trump became president, after all, by doing exactly this sort of trolling on social media. So politicians have a responsibility as well, Arion, don't they, to always make sure that they're conducting themselves in a way that couldn't be argued to be inviting this sort of thing.
I mean, I think that is a really important point, that there has been a huge race to the bottom, and unfortunately politicians have been part of that. They haven't tried to maintain a higher standard of decorum in the way that we might have expected them to in the past necessarily, and I think that it's hugely problematic in Grote's case in particular, that he did, as Kari mentioned, all of the things that were seen as hypocritical in their own right in the first place. If he's lambasting people for being ignorant and daft for going out and partying in Hamburg when he did the exact same thing himself, then arguably he is a bit of a willy. And I think that almost makes this itself nearly fair comment, not least of all because it's comparatively innocent. But the point about the terminology that you use being important, I think once you start to get any more serious than something like calling someone a pimmel or a willy, then I think then there are potentially questions to answer.
And I think going on from that, we've talked about how the government is basically to some extent shifting responsibility on the platforms to police this sort of content. And it does feel like there's also a slight shifting generally of responsibility for example, of online hate for violence against MPs. Obviously it's a factor, but it seems simplistic. There's the knottier problems of security and radicalisation and the failure of the government to prevent counter-terrorism strategy, and plus just the potential role of socialisation or mental health issues. So to sort of focus everything on this, it's just, I think we have to be wary of trying to present a simplified solution that will be no such thing.
Although one of the very simple solutions, Theo, that is being discussed by the government is to stop social media users being able to post anonymously. And I know that the debate around that is based around, you have repressed people, you have people in compromised relationships, you have whistleblowers, and they wouldn't be able to post publicly. But that's always struck me as being fundamentally untrue. I mean, they would be able to post publicly anonymously somewhere else, and then a user on social media who is named would be able to retweet it. So, I mean, you can get a message out there. You just wouldn't be able to have your own profile. Isn't it worth that sacrifice so that someone at Twitter or Facebook would be able to say, well, this is the guy who's racially abusing everyone?
To me, the most obvious objection to the doing away with the anonymity thing is that it actually probably would be really hard to make it work. Because how do you verify people on the internet? There's no way of verifying people on the internet.
You can upload a passport, can't you? That's how the government's been doing it for
Great. Well,
coronavirus.
that's not at all like a GDPR issue, is it? But putting up all of your vital details and giving them to a huge multinational. Obviously that's deeply problematic.
And also, anonymous posts can usually be traced through existing police powers anyway, like linked to IP addresses. Plus, there was actually a Twitter probe following the abuse of 3 England footballers at the Euro 20 final. And Twitter found that 99% of account owners were identifiable, and ID verification probably wouldn't have prevented the abuse anyway. If they're going to do it, they're going to do it. I mean, a lot of experts are saying what would be more effective would be for platforms to be obliged to change some of that algorithm so that people who are posting hateful content don't just end up in, being directed to like-minded users. So they just end up in these echo chambers. That might be more effective.
But then you can't clamp down on individuals who agree with the sentiment amplifying it.
No, but maybe you can stop them from being further radicalised. And I suppose that's the suggestion, particularly in the case of David Amos, that in trying to legislate against people sharing the sorts of hateful rhetoric that inflames one another into, ultimately, if you believe that this is the case, acting in violent ways, then that's the thing that you're trying to prevent by by stopping people from being able to congeal in these ways and their views from being operating in these echo chambers. It is a complex question, though, and I don't think there's a simple answer, unfortunately. Anytime you legislate, you're operating with a fairly big stick. And actually, Horst Niens, who was the police union representative in Hamburg, who said she wanted just this cycle of painting over the protesters who were doing murals, said, "I have a feeling that what we're doing is using cannons here to shoot at sparrows." And I think that's the problem in general with legislating to try to stop this sort of thing.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree with that. In that I think what you need to do is you have a hierarchy. So as I understand it, the problem now quite often is you report to Twitter, I'm a female MP and I've got a death threat. Then they're very slow, and particularly if you're not a female MP, they don't do anything about it. It's too big. They've got too many of these things. They don't care. So what you do is you have. I mean, it is basically a totally intractable and impossible problem. But what you can do is get a hierarchy. Right up the top, you have incitement to hatred, hate speech, death threats, and then lower down you deal with things like misinformation and juvenile abuse, and that is something that is in a completely different regime. But if we want something that is going to be taken seriously, it's got to address itself to the real harms which we know are out there.
Okay, Theo, I will be taking your story seriously after this. Listeners, as the news becomes more polarised, it's easy to fall into an echo chamber just when it's more important than ever to be open-minded to other points of view. And that is where The Week magazine comes in. Each week, our editors curate the best of the week's British and international media, presenting you with all sides of the debate so you can make up your own mind on the issues that matter most. And you, podcast listeners, can now get a free trial of The Week magazine. To receive 6 free issues plus free digital access, visit theweek.co.uk/offer and enter the promo code podcast. You won't have to pay anything for 6 weeks and can cancel any time, no strings attached. That's theweek.co.uk/offer and the promo code podcast. Theo, your turn. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
It was a week when lecturers got serious about casualisation.
Casualisation effectively means that this profession of being an academic, of being a university teacher and lecturer, is being de-skilled. It means that students don't have access to tutors that often. Plenty of staff have to teach here and in 2 or 3 other institutions. You can't see a lecturer for tutorial easily at the moment in higher education.
Winchester University lecturer Gordon McKelvey speaking to Eastleigh News last year, and if it helps paint a picture, he was wearing a high-vis jacket and carrying a placard at the time. So Theo strikes. What's been going on this week?
The University and College Union is balloting their members across the UK about whether to go on strike. So they have 2 motions. One is about pensions because the universities are trying to cut their pensions. And the other thing is what they call the 4 fights, which is basically about the conditions, pay, workload, equality and casualisation, which is what we're going to talk about this week. And this basically means hiring lots of academics on short, insecure contracts of one kind or another. Which is quite a big thing in the academic sector, which you think of as perhaps being all sort of gentle and nice. But in fact, a third of all academics are employed on sort of short-term contracts, and quite a lot of them on 0 hours.
Okay, I mean, a lot of people listening to this are on short-term contracts. I mean, I'm a freelancer. I'm not on any kind of contract at all to do this job. There's plenty of people listening, and that's just the way life is. The gig economy doesn't mean you're badly paid. Is this necessarily a problem?
No, I think, not necessarily. I think, you can see how if you're a university, then you're going to have a lot of people. You've got a lot of different needs to meet. You've got some people who are teaching 1 term, some people who are teaching 1 year, some people who are teaching a few supervisions. The issue is that in some cases they do use this just a lot more than you would think they would. So in Cambridge, for instance, which is famous for its undergraduate tutorials, the UCU found that nearly half of them are taught by people who aren't on proper contracts. So these will just be gig people. Of course, it's not like Uber. These people mostly are employed, if on short-term contracts, but not full-time ones. I guess the issue is, and I think the UCU are fighting a good battle on this, which is that, you don't want university to become like they are in some countries such as America or Australia, where you have 2 entirely different tracks, where you have the tenured professors who have really quite a nice time. And then on the other track, you have these poor people who actually do all the teaching and get paid relatively peanuts and have zero rights.
And when we say poor people, Kari, how much are they being paid? I mean, are lecturers being paid below minimum wage?
There was a recent study by the University and College Union, and it was reported by The Guardian, and this was Cambridge again. But just to point out, it's not just Cambridge. This has been found to be across the board. Some of these tutors did speak to The Guardian about what they were being paid, and effectively they said they were being paid a rate of £31 per tutorial, but that also includes covering reading lists and marking papers. So ultimately, when you look at all that preparation and follow-up, it worked out about £5 per hour, and that's not livable. There was also a very good Guardian article last week about an English lecturer from the US who'd come over here as a postgrad student, but she also did teaching, and she ended up secretly living in a tent for 2 years. She kept it secret to protect her professional standing. But to be fair, the university didn't know about that, and they do emphasise this in the article. But she said that basically, even with her teaching and her annual fellowship and winning an extra scholarship from the US, she was effectively left to live with £12,000 a year, which you can't do in London.
No, which is the sort of obvious point, isn't it, Arion? I mean, you know, you can sort of philosophise about this, but it does just come down to numbers. You probably can live on 12 grand in other parts of the country. You know, if you're in rural Wales or something and the university's putting you up for free in accommodation, then you probably can. But in Cambridge or in London, you can't. And it's bizarre that that's not factored into these salaries, seemingly.
And I think as well, so much of how university supervisors are paid is on the basis of their face-to-face time with students, when in actual fact they have to do an enormous amount of work outside of their lectures or tutorials even to prepare. So that's how it cuts down, you know, and it increasingly becomes such a terrible hourly rate. And it's not just Cambridge and London where people are struggling to make ends meet. And we do know that for a long time, academics have been underpaid in any case. I mean, if you want to be sympathetic to the problem that universities are having, their finances are being damaged on two sides, both by Brexit and the challenges of getting students in who previously would have arrived from the EU. There was an estimated shortfall of 62.5 million per year in tuition fees to UK universities this year alone, plus also the problems of the COVID crisis and the way in which students who are asking for refunds on the fees that they've paid, not sort of unreasonably, that burden is being carried by universities. So you can see why universities' coffers are struggling, but to pass those financial woes onto your academics seems like the very worst solution to the problem that you're facing.
I suppose as well, Arion, it's difficult for the clients, in this case, the students, to do much about this. They're not going to impede their own education, are they? They're going to cross a picket line and go into the library because they need to read the book. It's sort of difficult to know how they could really join in without harming their own prospects.
And largely students have been quite supportive of the academics who have conducted these strikes, because this won't be the first one if it does happen. There have been 3 similar strikes over the last few years, and largely students have supported them, I think because they understand the importance of academics getting paid properly for their work. But often the argument is made that you know, striking academics are only damaging students' educations, and that should be a reason for them not to strike. But it's very difficult to think of how else they can try to maneuver the university hierarchies to make sounder decisions that will be more favourable to them other than this. It's, you know, again, it's a blunt instrument, but it sort of seems like the most obvious way to try to affect change.
Theo, what do you think the impact of this will be if indeed the academics concerned do vote to strike? And we're slightly delicate because we're recording on the Thursday and they're voting today, so listeners that are interested in this will already know the outcome and we don't. But if they do vote to strike, what's the likely impact?
Well, I think it will be PR-wise not a very good move to strike now, because COVID has put so much disadvantaged the current crop of students so badly, and they've lost out so much. It just seems like another unnecessary blow. And also, you know, they do pay a lot for it now, and I think there will be fury on the right, certainly, if this happens.
Well, then you ask, if they're paying so much, these students, which they are, Kari, where is that money going? Because these days when so much is being done remotely, and it is literally a connection between your professor and you over Zoom, what is the university doing in that scenario apart from paying for the academic to talk to you?
Well, I mean, we've talked before on the podcast about how droves of students are quitting because they're fed up of doing everything remotely and they're missing out on the university experience. But UK universities are in crisis. They're going bust very quickly. You can understand what's driving these sort of cost-cutting measures. But yeah, I think you make a fair point. If your only cost of getting this, of getting staff is to plonk them in front of a video, then perhaps there is no argument to justify it.
But are there soft soap ways of keeping these academics on board, Arion? If you were the Chancellor of a university, is there just some good PR you can do to try and turn this around that doesn't have to cost lots of money and just makes people feel a bit more valued?
I mean, the things that the UCU are asking for aren't enormous. I mean, they're talking about pay increases of within the realms of £2,000 to £3,000 per person, which I know does add up as you include more and more people in that. But it does feel as though there's not another solution other than paying people more fairly for the work that they're doing, particularly when you read stories like the PhD student who's providing supervision while living in a tent. It's hard to think that any other response other than supporting your workers and paying them better is appropriate.
Well, it might be hard to think for anyone who read that in The Guardian, Theo, but as you hinted, the press on the right might have a very different view on this. And that's sort of unavoidable just through the nature of talking about academics, isn't it? It's seen as something quite high-minded and blue chip and therefore middle class, even if the reality is someone is living in a tent.
Yeah, I think we have to acknowledge that the reality is not really someone living in a tent. I think I'm going to come out and say this is an outlier. Living in a tent is unusual among...
Well, I suppose that is what makes it news, isn't it?
Yeah, so absolutely. These are people with a good education and plenty of options. It's not Uber, it's not Deliveroo. It is different that, so we need to keep that in focus, I think.
Though, with that said, the spokesperson for the University of Cambridge, who came out to defend what was going on, particularly in relation to gig workers, said that, first of all, she said that these colleges are separate legal and financial employers, so it's very difficult for them to come up with a single agreement. Fair enough. I can see how it's hard to regulate when actually each college has its own rules. But the second thing that she said was, supervisor training is provided for free and the average pay for supervision, including preparation, is well above the living wage. And I just thought, that's a very thin way of suggesting that you're paying people appropriately, particularly academics. You'd think that this is an area of society where you'd be quite ambitious with your pay packages because you want to attract people who are going to not only be good themselves, but be able to train the next generation of bright sparks to contribute to the economy as well. So I don't know. It felt like, even though you're right, the person living in tent is an outlier, you can definitely do better paying academics than you currently do.
Okay, Arion, you're going to be finishing the show after this. Arion, your turn. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
This week we learned that online love can sometimes lose connection.
I think a lot of it is to do with meeting a relative stranger. And we're all strangers when we meet, of course, at first. But we've got friends and family and work colleagues, whatever, who've known that person for a long time and can perhaps give us a little bit of balance to the best foot forward that we're seeing in that person. So, when we go out together, when we're dating with one another, we see each other through rose-tinted spectacles, and we're doing the best that we can. We're showing our good side.
Research Director of the Marriage Foundation, Harry Benson, speaking to GB News on Tuesday. Arion, what's he talking about?
So this week, a new survey found that couples who first met online are apparently 6 times more likely to divorce in the first 3 years of marriage than those...
Oh, that's a lot.
Than those who got together through friends, family and neighbours. It is a lot. So the research was conducted by Savanta Comres, which is this marketing research consultancy who surveyed just over 2,000 married UK adults over 30 and found that 12% of people who met in that way online had separated in the first 3 years, which I agree does seem like a lot, compared with 2% of all other marriages. And just a little bit of information hygiene warning here. The study was commissioned by this organisation that you mentioned called the Marriage Foundation, which is led by a former judge named Sir Paul Coleridge, who seems to be slightly obsessive about the idea that traditional marriage is crucial and the only way to get a functioning society, which seems to be the business of the charity he runs. But still, separately from him, the study was by a legitimate agency, which tends to return reliable results. And the findings, I think, are at least interesting and kind of worthy of our discussion.
Well, another footnote to bear in mind, Kari, and I'm going to quote from the story that the Times wrote on this. Researchers made no distinction between couples brought together by Tinder and Grindr, seen as hookup sites, and dating apps such as eHarmony. And yet those platforms are very different, aren't they? If you hook up on a casual sex app, the basis of your union was physical attraction. Great if you manage to get a relationship out of it, but that's different to meeting someone through a more holistic, based on interests as well as looks platform.
Yeah, I think there are all sorts of gaps in this study, to be honest. I mean, there have been plenty of previous research that have found that marriages from online relationships were more likely to last longer. So I think, one, it's not necessarily an entirely unbiased study. And also, what about breakup statistics for unwed couples? Researchers also found that online couples who want to wed tend to hook up, as in head down the aisle, sooner than their offline counterparts. So, you could argue, well, they've gone into it. They really, they just really want to get married. They may jump the gun a bit. So that might lead to divorce, and also they have maybe a more idealized view of what a marriage is meant to be. But I'd be interested to see the statistics in terms of what the breakups are for the ones who don't marry as compared to people who just live together, having met through friends and family.
I wonder as well, Theo, whether crudely, this slice of people are just more experienced people, perhaps more promiscuous people. Therefore, when they end up in marriages and they're not happy, they're more likely to think, well, I've got other options available to me than someone who's perhaps settled down with, the first person that said yes.
I remember doing quite a lot of work on online dating and what it was doing to couples and all that. And that was one of the recurring themes, is that you just sort of served up this sort of potentially vast number of people that you could end up with. And that makes you far more likely to sort of think, well, I've got another option.
And that's not necessarily a bad thing. I mean, what doesn't come out in this study is whether people are leaving unhappy marriages rather than just marriages. I mean, it might be good if people feel more willing to leave an unhappy marriage.
This is 2,000 people and it's a poll. So, I mean, I assume that Savanta Comrades are they're a good company, so I'm sure they've done it fairly responsibly, but there's a limit to what you can infer from it. But I think it probably is, it is really interesting that basically, if you look at the way they categorise it, in the old days, the biggest single place that you met came in the romantic sounding category of bar/elsewhere. And that's now been replaced by, it's swapped over with online, which is going right up and looking like it's going to carry on. And it will become, at the moment, I think friends and family, most things would say friends, family, etc., people is the biggest single way you meet other people. But online is going to be biggest. Socially, that's completely different. You're going to end up with that, in the old days, you would meet people who were inside your social networks. Now you might well end up with someone who's outside them. And it makes sense to me that a marriage is probably, particularly in the early years, slightly more difficult if you don't come to it with similar assumptions and all that.
It's interesting, actually, that this survey did find that the gap in the divorce rate starts to narrow after 5 years of marriage. So, at which point you have built up your shared social connections. And they found that within about 10 years, the divorce rate was only about a quarter higher. I mean, still obviously more, but higher in couples that had met online. But, as you said, Ollie, perhaps they've just got more not progressive, but they're less traditional views and are more willing to get divorced if it's not working out.
Okay, Arion, you brought us this story. Give us the hot take. Go on. What do you want to say about this? We've discounted the research on numerous fronts, but why is it significant?
Well, I think it's significant because, as Theo was saying there, the number of people who are meeting online as compared to via the ways that we regard as more traditional is increasing really rapidly. And there's an estimation that by 2035, if current trends continue, most people will have met their partner online more than any other way. So I think it is worth digging into exactly how those relationships are going to form, how they're going to carry on, and how they're going to fall apart. I don't know that this study itself is sufficient for us to be able to draw all the conclusions we need. I do think it's interesting that what it found was that relationships that are formed online are particularly shaky 3 years after marriage, which always seems such a sort of particularly sad moment for a relationship to come unstuck. You'd think that either before the marriage when you haven't committed all of that money and effort into organising a wedding, or significantly after the wedding when you've actually been with that person for some time. It seems, I don't know, more sort of understandable, but it does seem particularly sad for relationships to be falling apart at that moment. So that in itself,
how many years have you been married, Arion?
Yeah, oh God, I'm in the danger zone.
You are, aren't you?
Yeah.
Child on the way. Can you hear the optimism in his voice, Kari?
Well, except that we didn't meet online, so perhaps our chances
Sure.
are better.
You're fine.
Yeah. But I do think that question that Kari asked about how other forms of relationships, not marriages, other forms of long-term partnership, fare among people who have met online. That's the thing that we need to look into, because we know that divorce rates are going down in this country, unusually for having spent a long time coming up, but so too are marriage rates, and I think that kind of accounts for the fact that now we're seeing divorce rates coming down. So I think we really do need to be attentive to the other forms of long-term commitment that aren't just marriages, if we're going to assess the kinds of success we can expect from meeting digitally.
Yeah, because huge numbers of people cohabit these days, don't they, Kari, and even have kids together without getting married. So that's going to affect these stats too.
I'm among that group, actually. Yeah.
And how's it going?
We're still together.
Let's just have a therapy session.
It's been 20 years, lost the will to leave, really.
When we looked into this, did a briefing on it, what the research seemed to say is that online dating, particularly Match.com and all the eHarmony and all the sort of sensitive ones, make all these claims about their work. But really, that what the research seemed to say is that they're very good at matching people for geography and attractiveness. So you're nearby and you like the look of each other. Tinder, for instance, does this on the chess rating, the ELO rating thing, that you can tell how attractive people are, and then you can smooth out supply and demand. What they're not very good about is long-term compatibility, because long-term compatibility is not the kind of thing you can really write algorithms for.
No, and also I suppose it would be anathema to their business model. You want to be pairing people with the kinds of people who they quite like, but then it falls apart and they return to eHarmony again.
That would be ideal for them, perhaps a 5-year cycle.
Oh, God. It's like dreams, isn't it? Change your mattress every 7 years. I suppose in the pandemic as well, Kari, the lines between what's real life, quote unquote, and what is our online persona are so blurred now. I mean, we're having this conversation on Zoom. We have only done these podcasts digitally for, 2 years now. Lots of people are working like that as well as dating like that. And so social life isn't so different, is it? I mean, can you really even make the distinction?
It's difficult, but ultimately, if you're going to be a couple, you do probably actually have to live together, not just communicate via Zoom. And it's interesting that divorce inquiries in the UK have doubled during the pandemic. And obviously, we've all been through a huge amount of stress and, lockdowns. We've been forced to spend unprecedented amounts of time with our other halves. But ultimately, what makes a relationship doesn't, the core things don't change, and that's got to be sustained either way.
I read an interesting bit of commentary by Michael Rosenfeld, who's a sociologist at Stanford University, who was talking to the LA Times about sort of similar issues to exactly what we're talking about. And one of the things that he said, having studied a lot of online relationships, is that there's an assumption society-wide that what everyone is after is settling down, but actually increasingly people's behaviours in online dating and elsewhere are showing that isn't necessarily the case. And I think almost perhaps the challenge to the Marriage Foundation in particular, but also our sort of lazy thinking about what constitutes good relationships is that broad idea that we are all aiming for something that, if it isn't marriage, it's akin to marriage, a sort of long-term partnership. And maybe that's not what people most naturally want. The stats show that in the UK, the average marriage length before a divorce is around 12 years. Who knows? Maybe that's the sort of standard for what people are actually aiming for. I just think there's a lot here to be teased out. And yes, this study in itself is insufficient, but I think it's heading us towards some interesting questions.
I feel like Arion's really got it in for the Marriage Foundation. All of the stats do also show that, I mean, I get causation and correlation very hard to prove, but that marriage is really good for loads of outcomes, like raising children, like staying together, like not dying young, all that sort of stuff. So, I don't think it's completely ridiculous to be putting in a good word for marriage here and there.
Well, by the powers vested in me, I now pronounce this episode over. Thank you, everybody. You can follow this show for free and get every episode as soon as it's released. Just search for The Week Unwrapped wherever you get your podcasts, and join us each week till death do us part. And if you found us today via a Spotify playlist, then tap go to podcast and then tap follow now. I've been Olly Mann. Our music is by Tom Morby, the producer Sophie King at Rethink Audio. Until next time, bye-bye.